and John Berman.
All right, good morning and welcome to your new day. It is Thursday, December 27th, 8 o'clock in New York. Allison is off. Erica Hill joins me. I think we're in the countdown to the new year. Has it officially begun yet?
We're officially in the countdown to the new year. The question is, are we in the countdown to the end of the shutdown?
I'm going to go with no.
I'm right there with you.
I'm going with the new year comes well before the end of the shutdown.
Here we go.
The president and first lady, they are back at the White House after the surprise holiday visit to U.S. troops in Iraq. This is the president's first visit to a combat zone, and it comes days after a sudden decision to pull U.S. troops out of Syria. That's the decision that he is defending despite a fair amount of criticism from both sides of the aisle. The president insists that the United States is no longer, quote, and this is what he said, the suckers of the world.
The president's Iraq visit also turning political. President Trump went after Democrats in front of U.S. troops, blaming Democrats for the government shutdown, the same one he promised to own. The president gave no time frame to end the shutdown, saying he would do whatever it takes to get his border wall. Meantime, we are now in day 6 of that partial government shutdown. And while lawmakers are also back in Washington today, along with the president, there is no sign of a deal to come. Joining us now, White House correspondent for the New York Times, Maggie Haberman. Always good to have you with us. Maggie, as we look at this visit, I mean, when this came out, there was some speculation maybe on Thanksgiving it would happen. It didn't happen. So all of a sudden, as we started to see these rumblings yesterday, it was fascinating to know that the president was making this trip.
Yeah, it's interesting. There was a lot of speculation that he did this basically while sitting watching television and said, fire up, Air Force One. That is not how it works. These trips take several weeks to plan. They had been working on this for some time. They clearly were aware of the criticism he was receiving. It is an important visit that he did this. He has been very heavily criticized for not doing such a visit. It is important to note when he did. It's also important to note that while he was there, he said a number of things to the troops that you are not used to seeing, one doesn't see, from a U.S. president. He used the same language that he uses at his political rallies. He told stories that inflated his own role in military spending and in pay raises, suggested that he had given the military members their first pay raise, I think, in a decade. That's not true. They've had received raises every year. He suggested it was much bigger than it was. And all of those things undercut him. But it is, at the end of the day, it is about the members of the military, and the troops who were there in Iraq clearly seemed happy to see him. Mm-hmm.
You just summed up the entire visit, I think.
Oh, sorry. I can go now.
No, yeah, you're done. Thank you, Maggie Haber. No, but you're right. The troops, I think, welcome the visit of the commander-in-chief almost always, and it's good we hear from military leaders for the president to see U.S. troops in combat, to see what they go through. So, yes, if that's the low bar, the president met that, and it's terrific that he did it. But you also pointed out some of the controversy here. Just one thing I do want to clear up. You said about the planning of this, we believe, every reason to believe this was in the planning well before James Mattis, Secretary of Defense, announced his resignation.
It was. I mean, there's no question that it was. Again, these trips do not. We had been hearing for a while that he was looking at doing this. Other people had been as well. I think that the impetus became stronger once James Mattis left, and once the president was making a declaration about troop withdrawal from Syria. I think the onus became, all the more on him to do something to show that he understood the sacrifice that American troops make, and that he did not look like he was being capricious. But it is certainly true that people tend to look at everything through the lens of him reacting. I don't think this was just him reacting.
You can't pull off a trip like this in 2 days. It just doesn't work like that. All right, another point you were making, the president making up facts or lying, depending on how you want to say it, about military pay raises. Let's play that sound so people can see it.
The biggest pay raises you've ever received. You haven't gotten one in more than 10 years. More than 10 years. And we got you a big one. I got you a big one. I got you a big one. They had plenty of people that came up. They said, we could make it smaller. We could make it 3%. We could make it 2%. We could make it 4%. I said, no. Make it 10%. Make it more than 10%. Because it's been a long time. It's been more than 10 years.
I do not know in his head where he's getting that from, because
he's getting it from his head. I don't think that there's. I mean, he just told this line about how it could have been 3%, it could have been 2%, but I said no. It actually was between 2 and 3%. It was 2.6%, and it was on par with raises that members of the military had received every year.
That's it. Right. There's been a military pay raise every year, practically for nearly the past 30 years, and you can argue whether it's enough. I would say, I'd like to see them be much higher. But the point is, there have been raises every year in the last 3 years. They weren't 10%. Even if you add them all up, it's not 10%.
He tends to talk as if numbers in dollars are the most important thing, and he talks about that in the context of everything he does. We have seen this over many years, number one. And number two, some people close to him used to say, well, the reason that he says things like this, he makes these false statements, is those are the things he wants the media to focus on. This is not good for the media to be focusing on. No. This just undercuts his trip. This undercuts something that he did that was, a clear positive, and it was one of the, while it was a conventional thing that he did, a trip to visit troops overseas, sometimes convention is good. This is the president who has decided that convention is generally bad. In this case, it was good. It was good for the military. It was good for him. And there's no reason to undercut it with the imaginary numbers.
Or even to undercut it with politics. So, a number of our military analysts, retired generals, retired colonels, have said this is exactly what we've all said. This is great. This is what the troops needed. This is what the president needed to do, to go there and to see it. But General Mark Hurdling telling us, listen, normally when these visits happen, and he's been there for when presidents visit a war zone, you pull whoever it is coming over, the lawmaker, and say, just a reminder, this isn't a political event. Find your constituents, take a picture, but keep it above board. The president, Air Force Colonel telling us he believes he probably had that conversation, either ignored it or just, didn't care and went out there and directly attacked Democrats and went right for the jugular and made it more of a, to your point, campaign rally.
He does this everywhere he goes, and you know this. Almost every setting that he is in, he turns into some kind of, yet again, an up-down referendum on himself. And so that is what he did there. Wall funding, the Democrats, Nancy Pelosi. I'm confident that someone told him this is not the place to do this, because people often tell him that he shouldn't do the things that he does, and he does them anyway. He will go and do what he wants to do. It shouldn't surprise anyone by now. It just doesn't make it appropriate to do it at this particular venue.
How much is this shutdown weighing on his head? What do we know about his current plans on this?
His current plans are to stick, and he said it, and it's consistent with what he is saying privately to people, that he is dug in. He is going to try to wait for the Democrats to cave. The problem with that, so we're looking right now realistically at a shutdown that goes into next year, or goes into the new Congress. The problem for the president is that Nancy Pelosi has a lot of cards to play right now, and why would she give in? This is a shutdown. You could have maybe made that argument if you were the president, had he not made this display in the Oval Office of saying, I will be proud to own this shutdown. That video is what it is. And so if you are Nancy Pelosi and you are coming in with a new majority and members who are hungry not to give Trump any sense of a victory, I think unless the pressure feels, equally exerted for her and for her caucus and the president, then you will start to see some movement. But that's not where he is right now.
I think there's something else fascinating, too, about that Oval Office meeting with the president and Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi. And that is that, and this is a completely non-political statement, but Nancy Pelosi was the grown-up in that room with the other two men who were there. And she was very calm the entire time and very composed and tried to stay on message. And, the reporting is even asked them not to do it on camera. The president loves Nancy Pelosi as a foil because she's a great foil for Republicans. But I wonder if there's more to it, and if part of it doesn't come from that meeting as well.
More to it, meaning that he took it personally and that because of the way she behaved? Or
meaning that maybe the response that she got and the feedback on her in that Oval Office meeting, I wonder if that too, sort of just,
I think it helps. It helps, but I got to be honest. I mean, I've always thought that both she and the president got what they wanted in the very short term out of that meeting. She got to look good for her base. He got to display to his base, which was a base that was not happy with him at that moment because he had pushed through this criminal justice reform bill that was not a conservative base priority. It was a Koch brothers priority, and so the way had been softened in a bipartisan fashion. But this is ultimately something that he was dealing with, where he has his voters feeling a little restless. That said, she got more for the long term than he did, because for the long term, he is saying, I'll happily own a shutdown. And they had a deal, and he pulled back from the deal. Right. So at the end of the day, I think what is going on for her is just the knowledge that she has a lot more power right now than she has had at any point in many years, and Democrats are not eager to hand the president something where he can say, look, I got this done. So
you said she has a lot of cards to play. It does appear she is already playing them, right? Correct. I mean, yesterday I was struck by the comment she made upon the president's return, saying that the wall keeps changing and now it's a beaded curtain, were Nancy Pelosi's words. She called it a beaded curtain. And as soon as I heard that from her, I'm like, wow. She is poking. That is more than poking.
Well, she's been trying to make him sound weak. I mean, her language has been very specific on this since the day of that meeting where she questioned his manhood. And now she's talking about beaded curtains. She knows how to tweak him, and she is going for it. She is showing him that she is not going to be pushed around. This president is somebody who has bent people to his will over and over and over, and she is, I think, trying to demonstrate she is not going to be one of them.
The other thing that I think that was fascinating yesterday is the president saying, listen, by whatever means necessary, we are going to get this wall done. Right. He was then asked 3 times by a reporter whether he could see his way to $2 billion in funding versus 5, and he very clearly avoided that question, didn't want to answer it. It sounds like $2 billion is not whatever it would take in his mind.
I don't think it is whatever it would take, but I also think it's important to bear in mind that Donald Trump is very good at, ripping up whatever is in front of him and telling you it actually looks like this, such as a pay raise that was not actually 10% or what have you. And he will do what he will recharacterize whatever the government will open ultimately, and whatever it is that he ends up agreeing to, he will characterize as a solid win. Nancy Pelosi is going to do everything she can to make it harder for him to sell it that way.
Sure. Do we think the president can stay in Washington? A lot of people on social media.
You mean long term, or do you mean right now?
I mean short term. I mean, he canceled his trip to Mar-a-Lago because of the shutdown.
The first leg, sure, yeah. I mean, look, what I've heard from several people is he wants to go. At the same time, I don't think that going to Mar-a-Lago for these extended stays is as fun for him as it used to be. It used to be that he could go down and he was almost seen as this wizard who could give people whatever they want. And now people ask these questions that he can't really give easy answers to, or people want something from the president that he can't necessarily do because he's discovered what the limits of executive power are. So I think it doesn't hold quite the same allure. I'd be very surprised if he misses the New Year's party that he throws every year there. There's some other event down there that I think he wants to go to, some other ball a few days later. I could see him going down for a short amount of time, and I think that the calculation is the trip to Iraq makes it a little easier for him to then take a vacation.
There's been a lot of talk, obviously, about the Fed chair as well, the president attacking him. But then we had reporting yesterday that he's willing to meet with the Fed chair, that this could happen in the next, I guess, week or two in early 2019. Was the message getting through to him? I mean, is that the sense that he was finally understanding that attacking the Fed chair is certainly not helping the markets?
No, I don't think it's a sign of that. I think it's a sign that people around the president are desperately trying to calm the markets and are saying things like that. I don't think it would change anything. I mean, I think that a meeting is lovely, but the president either stops tweeting or doesn't stop tweeting. Right. And you will notice that there was a correction upward yesterday in the Dow, and it was also coincided with a period where the president was on an airplane and not tweeting. Yeah. So, I mean, I think that what they're trying to do is show the president your actions directly affect things. And the president, it's not that he doesn't know that, he just sometimes can't help himself.
I will say this idea of this summit between the president of the United States and the chair of the Fed creates its own problems. Yes, if they're meeting as if they are somehow rivals.
Or as if they're sort of working together. The whole point of the Fed is it's supposed to be apolitical and independent. And there is just this idea that you're bringing together sort of, a boss and a worker, and that's not what
it has happened before, but it is, to your point, it is rare, and it is.
And under these circumstances, it's not ideal.
Yeah.
Maggie Haberman, great to have you. Thanks so much. President Trump now back from his first visit to a war zone. We're going to get reaction from a Democratic congressman who served in Afghanistan. That's next. President Trump is back in the White House after his surprise visit to U.S. troops in Iraq. The president thanked the service members there for their service, but could not resist the urge to wade into politics, blaming Democrats for the government shutdown in front of U.S. troops. Joining us now is Democratic Congressman Jimmy Panetta. He is an Afghanistan war veteran, a member of the Armed Services Committee. Congressman, thank you so much for being with us. The president visiting a war zone, you, of course, served overseas, a positive thing, correct?
Of course. And thank you, John, for having me and giving me this opportunity to be here with you.
I appreciate that. It's a low bar. You can come on any time. If you're going to be that appreciative, we'll have you on even more. I could use the adulation for that. Now, what did you make of the president's trip overseas? Again, it is something that people felt was long overdue, but he did it, and it is undoubtedly good for a president to visit troops in a war zone.
Of course. I mean, you have to give credit where credit is due, and it was great to see the president actually getting out of the White House, getting out of Mar-a-Lago, and going into a war zone. What you would hope, though, is that this is an opportunity for him to listen, to learn and not just lecture and not just have a political rally. But unfortunately, this president, as you heard your last guest on your show, this president is kind of a one-speed president. He only knows one thing, and that's basically holding these types of political rallies. And unfortunately, that's what we saw yesterday there in Iraq.
You did not feel it was appropriate to say what the president did about the government shutdown?
Look, like I said, I think the president as commander-in-chief has an obligation when he shows up in a war zone, when he's out talking with our troops. I think he needs to listen to learn. Listen and learn. When I was stationed in Afghanistan back in 07, 08, we did not have anybody as high as the commander-in-chief coming to visit us. But I can tell you, when Admiral Fallon, the CENTCOM general, came, when the Secretary of Navy came, it's a real shot in the arm. And I think you saw that yesterday. You saw these troops take to the president yesterday. They were excited that he's there. They loved that he was there on the ground with them. And I believe that the president actually felt that. And I guarantee you he'll probably be back in a war zone after this sooner rather than later.
Good. Yeah, let's hope. Let's hope, because I do think it is good for the troops. I also think it's good for any president to see the sacrifices that are made and have been made by the likes of you, sir. I do want to ask about something he said, which was very interesting in terms of policy. He was talking about the withdrawal of U.S. troops from Syria, which he has ordered and which led to the resignation of Defense Secretary James Mattis. And he said he intends to leave U.S. troops in Iraq, and he thinks the troops in Iraq can fill the void left by the U.S. forces in Syria. Operationally, do you think that's optimal?
Yeah, I do not. The key word you used is optimal. No, it's not optimal. Is it possible for them to conduct operations from a neighboring country? The answer is yes. But will it be as successful? And I would say no. And we saw that because early on, the uptick, the success that they had really started to grow once they had troops in Syria actually developing the intelligence necessary to have the type of targeted strikes that those special operators that were there in country actually used. And so I think, sure, you have certain assets, aerial assets, SIGINT and so forth that can be used outside of the country. But when it comes to when it comes to developing that raw intelligence, nothing beats having boots in the grounds in the country. And I think we've shown that it can help by the success that we've had in Syria going after ISIS and actually basically isolating them. The problem is ISIS is not over. ISIS is not dead. There are reports of 20 to 30,000 troops, 20 to 30,000 ISIS fighters, I should say, there in Syria, possibly in Iraq. We need to be aware of that. We need to continue this fight, and it helps when we have troops in Syria to do that.
I do want to ask you about one thing the president said there about the mission in Syria, and I think this translates to Afghanistan as well. He said the men and women who serve are entitled to clear objectives and the confidence when those objectives are met that they can come home and be with their families. Do you agree with that sentiment, and
Sure.
do you agree that he is projecting what the objectives are?
Well, look, I think it's obviously the troops, they're there to fight, obviously to succeed per the mission. And obviously the mission for our troops in Syria was to defeat ISIS. But at the same time, it's also doing what John Bolton said, of ensuring that Iran does not become an everlasting presence there and pushing back on that. And that is something that we are basically abdicating when we're taking troops out of Syria to do that. Now, when it comes to Afghanistan, I think it's time that we have a strategy set out. I appreciate the conditions-based strategy, but what are those conditions? As a member of the House Armed Services, we've been waiting to hear that ever since that change in strategy was announced. What conditions are they looking for?
Right.
And we're still waiting to hear that. And if you're sitting there saying, oh, we're going to pull out 7,000, half of the troops that are there, what's the strategy? And that's what I would hope that this administration comes up to Capitol Hill, tells members of the House Armed Services like myself, but also tells the American public. For considering that it's been the longest war in our history, we deserve that. And I hope that this administration understands that, and I hope the president understands that in setting out a long-term strategy for Afghanistan, for Iraq as well.
All right, Congressman, let's make a deal. Let's solve the government shutdown Let's do it the two of us right now. I'm going to come to the table and I'm going to say, we'll accept, if I'm the White House, we'll accept $2 billion for border security, which might include some improvements to the fences and whatnot that are already there. Would you take that as a Democrat?
Look, I think what it comes down to is that when you are talking about border security, inevitably you talk about comprehensive immigration reform. And that's where the conversation should start. It shouldn't start from the bottom up. It should start from the top down, comprehensive immigration reform going down to border security.
That's not where you and I both know that's not where it is right now. Right. We've had those discussions in the past. Last February, that all fell apart. In the last administration, they tried and fell apart. The one before that, they tried and fell apart. Where we are right now is we're trying to keep the government open until February. So I'm merely asking is if in the short term you would accept $2 billion in funding for, again, that would include border security and also perhaps some improvements to the fencing.
And my response to that is when we start talking about border security, we need to start talking about immigration reform as well, especially where I come from on the Central Coast of California. That type of immigration reform, saving our dreamers, making sure there is an earned pathway to citizenship is there. But let me tell you, we are concerned with border security as well. But they go hand in hand, and I can't stress that enough. And I believe that if the president came to the table and actually started talking about the elements of border security and not just talking about a cement wall, but actually talk about the technological aspects of it that are necessary for border security along our 2,000-mile southern border, then we can actually have a conversation. When he starts talking about an earned pathway to citizenship for people who deserve it, be it our dreamers, be it our TPS recipients, then we can actually have a real conversation with this administration about what type of comprehensive immigration reform, what type of border security we can get to. And then I think deals can be made. I realize that your pessimism when it comes to those types of discussions, but let me tell you, we have to be optimistic in this job, especially when it comes to immigration reform.
I am an eternal optimist, but also a realist. Congressman Jimmy Panetta, Democrat of California, thank you very much for joining us. Please come back. Appreciate having you on New Day.
Thank you, John. Happy holidays.
You too. Erica?
President Trump says the American people want his border wall. Is that true? We'll take a look next. President Trump showing no signs of backing down over funding for his border wall demand, insisting yesterday in Iraq the American people want it. Take a listen.
Look, the American public is demanding a wall. Nancy is calling the shots, and they all know, look, politically speaking, I don't do it for politics. I'm doing nothing for politics. But politically speaking, people want border security.
Joining us now to discuss, CNN political commentator Symone Sanders. She, of course, is the former press secretary for Bernie Sanders' 2016 campaign. Also, CNN political commentator Steve Cortez, the former head of President Trump's Hispanic Advisory Council. Great to have both of you with us this morning. The president saying people want border security. That is true. The American people do want border security. What they don't want, based on our most recent polling from just a couple of weeks ago, is they don't want the wall. In fact, 57% of Americans oppose building a wall along the entire border with Mexico. And that number actually increases if you ask how they feel about the wall if the U.S. pays, Steve.
Well, Erica, as you know with polls, it depends very much how you word it, who you ask. But to me, the poll that is much more important is the 2016 election, where the wall was Donald Trump's signature issue. It was the foundational promise of his presidency, of his candidacy then, presidency now. And the people spoke overwhelmingly and gave the president a mandate to build the wall. So that's the poll I care most about, is the one from November of 2016. He could not have been clearer about that topic.
That's
people spoke resoundingly.
That's what he wanted. He was also very clear that he said Mexico would pay for the wall. We know from Mexican presidents current and past, they will not pay for that wall. You can't do funny math and move money around in the government to get Mexico to pay for the wall. And the most recent polling, whether you like it or not, says we actually don't want the wall.
I'm not surprised I'm not surprised that Mexico isn't offering to pay for the wall. Of course not. But Mexico, this is a president who delivers on his promises, whether it's tax cuts or moving the Israel to Jerusalem or the wall, and Mexico paying for it. He is going to figure out how Mexico pays for it. We are effectively fronting the cash. He's a developer. Look at it as a construction loan. Mexico, there are a lot of ways to do this. For example, tax remittances is to me, the easiest and simplest way to pay for the wall, and Mexico will.
If I may, this is intellectually dishonest. What the president campaigned on. What the president campaigned on, among other things, was in fact that Mexico would build the wall. It was such a popular phrase that folks would shout it back at his rallies. The president did not campaign on we would front the money for the wall, that Mexico would pay for it. That being said, not only does some of CNN's most recent polling say Americans overwhelmingly do not support the wall, there was a PBS NewsHour NPR poll that came out just a couple weeks ago that said over 57% of Americans did not support shutting down the government for a border wall. They wanted the president to compromise to avoid gridlock. And so what has happened here is we are now in a day 6 of a partial government shutdown. That means the Department of Homeland Security, the State Department, the Justice Department, the Agriculture Department, among other departments, are now shut down because the president threw a temper tantrum and would not compromise. This is not what the American people want. The poll that Steve referenced, I'd like to remind him that there was an election in 2018 where an overwhelming number of Republicans on the House side ran on immigration. It was their closing argument. It was the president's closing argument. And they resoundingly were rejected. The American people rebuffed that message. And so I'm really not sure how this is a sound strategy. This is how they lost the House. This is how they lost a record number of governor seats, gubernatorial seats, state legislatures. And come January 3rd, Democrats are going to put a bill on the floor to reopen the government. And I would just hope that the president compromises and does what's best for all of Americans, not just his very small base.
Simone, if we want to talk polls, I think perhaps the most important poll of all is of the Customs and Border Protection officers, the actual frontline cops for America who are guarding our border. Their union officially wants a wall, has endorsed it. Their head has argued for it on this network and others vociferously. And in a poll of their members, 89% of them, of the officers, again, who are on the front lines doing this hard job of guarding our border, 89% say they want a wall.
But what do you say?
And that it will help them
let
do
me
their
point out
job
to you something else. No, I was going to say, let me point out something else that they say they need. And this is coming directly from the Commissioner of Customs and Border Protection, saying just yesterday, I have explained to Congress they are not set up for these groups of people who are crossing into the U.S. The facilities were built 30 to 40 years ago for single adult males. We need a different approach. We need help from Congress. And here's what he's asking for. We need to budget for medical care and mental health care for the children in our facilities. Steve, how much is that a focus for President Trump? Because that's needed too, and that's coming from the head of the CBP.
Right. Oh, listen, I think clearly we have an antiquated system in many ways in terms of facilities, but I would say even more so in terms of laws. Unfortunately, we have asylum laws which are being ridiculously abused and gamed because people come to our country, and we know this factually, the vast majority of them are not legitimate asylum candidates. They are economic migrants. If they wanted asylum, they would take it in Mexico where it was offered to them and work status. Very generous offers in Mexico. The fact that they crossed that massive country of Mexico to come to our border instead and then claim asylum, and only 10% of them from those Central American countries, historically, only 10% of them are viewed legitimate asylum seekers. The fact that they do that, but they do it knowing that our asylum laws guarantee that once they reach our soil, even though they crossed illegally, they can stay. That needs to change. If we change that law and build a wall, we will solve almost all of that problem at the border, and we won't be housing. Look, it's awful that we're housing thousands of children from Central America. I'm saying let's solve that problem. When we get rid of a porous border, we get rid of the incentives for people to come here for economic reasons, and then they can immigrate the right way, like my father did, like millions of Americans did, and become legal immigrants
so,
to this
Erica,
country.
if I may, I just want to be clear and say that the crisis that is currently happening at the border is, in fact, a crisis that is manufactured by the Trump administration, because folks are the legal way to seek asylum is to present yourself at a port of of entry into the United States of America. What has been happening over the last couple months is the Trump administration has been declining to process these folks. We are now housing folks in warehousing immigrants, migrants who are seeking asylum, and those claims are in fact not being processed. People are being deported. It's just a mess, is what you can see on the border currently right now. And so what we have is a breakdown, yes, in our immigration policy, but the Trump administration isn't even doing their part. And so it's not as though we have open borders in this country. If anybody has ever been to the border, there's a lot happening down there. There's a increased there's an increased law enforcement presence on the border. A wall is not going to solve our issues. What will solve our issues is fixing our broken immigration policy, which needs to happen. But what's happening on the border is, in fact, a crisis manufactured by the Trump administration. Let's not forget, not a couple weeks ago, the Trump administration shut down one of the most busiest ports of entry from between Mexico and the United States. They shut the border down because folks were coming to the port of entry to claim asylum. Like, what is happening here? Let's be honest.
All right, we have 1 minute left, so you each get
Simone, let's be honest,
you
they're
each
not
get 20 seconds. Steve,
you don't know because they're not being processed, Steve. That is ludicrous for you to suggest that these are not legitimate
they would take asylum in Mexico.
That is not how you claim asylum.
For their lives,
oh my goodness!
When they reach the stability
we're going to stop
of Mexico,
right here
they
because I'm going to give you both the chance. Just give me your best guess. When does the shutdown end? How does this get resolved? You each have 20 seconds. Simone, ladies first.
The shutdown ends when Democrats are in charge of the United States House of Representatives. They put a bill on the floor, and then the ball is then again in the president's court. And if he decides to veto it, I am pretty sure that Congress will override that veto because we need to get the government back open. This is a temper tantrum manufactured by the president.
All right,
Come
Steve.
on.
I think a legitimate compromise is $5 billion for the wall for permanent DACA protection. Both sides give. Neither side loves that trade, but that's the essence. That's the definition of a compromise, and it makes sense.
Steve, Simone, appreciate you both compromising on the timing that we had left there. Thank you both.
Thank you.
That might be the only compromise you get.
Yes, indeed.
All right. Trading resumes on Wall Street in less than an hour, but it looks like any wild day ahead after. It looks like it will be a wild day ahead after yesterday's historic rebound. Christine Romans tells us why next.
But first, the new CNN film Love, Gilda takes a look at the incredible life of the comedy legend Gilda Radner. It airs New Year's Day at 9 p.m. right here on CNN. But this morning, you get a sneak peek.
Hi, I'm Gilda Radner. And, okay, now. People want to know what made you funny. From the time I was a kid, I loved to pretend.
She was the very first performer chosen for the cast of Saturday Night Live.
There, Rosanna, dance.
They just loved her.
I basically stole all of my characters from Gilda. I can do almost anything if people are laughing. Boom, ba, ba, boom.
Gilda was just not quite herself.
One morning, she just said, I don't know what's wrong with me.
The comedian gets the most unfunny thing in the world.
So?
She felt that she could be of help, and that's exactly what she did.
How often do we get to know exactly how brave we are? I always felt that my comedy was just to make things be all right.
Love, Gilda, New Year's.
Liquid markets, a lot of automated trading, a lot of uncertainty with the headlines. So this is the way it's going to be, folks. It's going to be volatile. We had basically 10 years of straight up with a few exceptions. That's not going to happen anymore. It's not. This is a mature bull market that may be a bear market. We're very, very close here. The NASDAQ actually did fall into a bear market, but then popped out of it yesterday. Look at what happened yesterday. These numbers on the Dow. The Dow up 1,000 points. You have never seen that before. We've never seen the Dow add 1,000 points in a single day. That's about 5%. We have seen that before, lots and lots of times. Still, when you look at those percentage numbers, it was the biggest one-day percentage gain since March 2009. Recall, if you will, what we were doing in March 2009. The economy was falling apart, and that was the beginning of kind of a violent bounce back. What you're seeing here are oversold sell-offs, where they just sell way too hard, too long, and they're basically too pessimistic about what's going to happen in the economy next year, and then these false rebounds. That's what it looks like, the volatility at the end of a bull market. Now, yesterday we heard from Kevin Hassett, who's the president's chief, the Council of Economic Advisors, the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, and he really struck, I think, just the right tone. This is what he said about the Fed chief.
You made it very clear that Secretary Mnuchin's job is safe. Is the Fed chairman's job safe?
Yes, of course, 100%. Yes.
100%. Fed chairman's job is not in jeopardy by this president.
Absolutely. That's correct.
And that was just a critical little snippet that really helped. And then he said this about the economy.
All the anecdotal information we're getting is that the fundamentals remain extremely sound, that Christmas sales are through the roof. GDP in the fourth quarter is looking like it's going to be very close to, if not above 3 again. And so I think that the momentum that we saw this year is carrying forward to next year.
How long into next year? That's the big question. But at least that was just the right tone from a White House messaging team that's had a tough time sending out the right tone. I don't know if it's a coincidence the president was on a plane to Iraq and couldn't say anything or tweet anything negative about the Fed chief or stock market or who's to blame, but at least for yesterday, things seem solid. We'll watch to see if there's any reversals again here today.
100% safe is exactly what investors wanted to hear when it came to the Fed chief. Christine Romans, thanks so much. Appreciate it.
Berated in his own apartment building. Just ahead, a man opens up about the ugly confrontation with his neighbor. Was it racially motivated? His thoughts.